We're back in the home office in Brea. Internet, we're out of the master bedroom, which just personally,
thank goodness,
is it's helpful for me to focus. And welcome, Internet. Hello, everybody. Mike and Andy here, or as we call it, Andike. I don't know. Andy, I've got some. I see this thing going around on Twitter, which is like your favorite movies.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's like you name your top 7 or something.
Oh,
right?
sure. Okay.
Right. All right.
Yeah.
Quick, go.
Oh, top 7 movies.
Yeah.
Okay.
Trilogies count as one. Go.
Happy
Hipster,
Gilmore.
The Hipster Part 1.
Happy Gilmore.
The Hipster Part 2.
Mighty Ducks.
Oh,
trilogy.
Oh wow.
Naturally. Actually, is there a 4th? I can't remember.
I don't know.
Eternal Sunshine of a Spotless Mind.
Okay.
Oh man.
Rad.
Oh yeah. Any movie relevant to that gets me going.
That was a
really slow.
That's a real movie.
You got me here.
I know.
I'm sticking in the mud.
Yeah, you are.
But those first 3, knee jerk was it. Like,
okay.
Yeah, Mighty Ducks, Happy Gilmore.
All right.
And Eternal Sunshine. Those all come to mind really quick.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
That's quite the diversity of awfulness. All right. I was just curious.
In yours?
Just curious. I'm a big fan of Notting Hill and Pride and Prejudice.
Okay.
And Sense and Sensibility.
Yeah. Music and lyrics.
And Dumb and Dumber. And I don't know. No, I would say Gladiator, Braveheart, First Matrix, Star Wars original trilogy, Indiana Jones trilogy,
okay.
Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
I mean,
Jurassic Park.
No, I live that one. I don't need to see that one. Shawshank Redemption, probably.
Yeah,
throw that in there.
That's good. Uh-huh.
But the big news, I mean, that was just kind of an intro just to see. I wanted people to see why you're not the host of the podcast.
Yeah.
But the big news is that our podcast territory is being invaded.
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't think anybody or anything could knock Joel Osteen out of the top place in the iTunes podcast list.
Yeah.
So they list the 200 most popular.
Uh-huh.
And there are a bunch of categories. The big one is religion and spirituality. And then there's sub branches like Christianity and Buddhism and whatever else.
Right.
But the number one, it made it quite a splash. The number one new entry, knocking Vox out of the 137th spot, wherever. I don't even think we've hit it this week, but it's called Harry Potter and the Sacred Text. All right, now listen to this description. This is absolutely brilliant, and it's absolutely. I mean, it's knocked Osteen out. It's knocked
Rick Warren.
I've never seen Warren in the number one.
Sure.
Joyce Meyer.
Joyce Meyer gets up.
She
there,
gets up there.
Uh-huh.
But this has been dominant, and so here's the description, and I think it's so interesting. What if we read the books we love as if they were sacred texts? What would we learn? How might they change us? Harry Potter and the Sacred Text is a podcast reading Harry Potter, the best-selling series of all time, as if it were a sacred text. Just as Christians read the Bible, Jews the Torah, Muslims the Quran, we will embark on a 199-episode journey, one chapter per episode. To glean what wisdom and meaning J.K. Rowling's beloved novels have for us today, we will read Harry Potter not just as novels, but as instructive and inspirational texts that will teach us about our own lives. How awesome is that?
Didn't Joseph Smith have a big what if?
Well, that's it's certainly interesting. And here's what I love. First, I mean, we can learn and receive wisdom from any, right? And I think the Harry Potter series is just outstanding. It very much is. It presents virtue ethics and character formation in really compelling ways.
Yeah.
But it raises an interesting question. Why couldn't you? Who's to say what a sacred text is? Right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's like Avatar. After the movie Avatar came out years ago, there was this kind of burgeoning sort of worldview, religion based on some of the things. I mean, why the heck not? Why wouldn't you, in a world like ours where meaning is just, you bring it to a text, it's never found in a text, why wouldn't you do it? It makes total sense that religion and spirituality, the top podcast is reading Harry Potter as if it were sacred. And the interesting thing is, well, what does it mean for it to be sacred? What does that mean? Does that mean we deem it sacred?
Right. Is there like a year limit? Like, it has to be X amount of years old. Like, is that even relevant?
So I don't know. But I mean,
like a legend is defined specifically by its age, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
In which case you would be a legend as you hit your mid 40s. Yeah. And so very excited about that. No, I don't know. I mean, I just thought it was interesting, and it raises a question. Well, why wouldn't you read the Bible the same way you'd read Harry Potter? What difference is there between reading the Bible for inspiration and reading the Harry Potter series for inspiration, other than the Harry Potter series is much more well written? I mean, if it's much more entertaining. I mean, Harry Potter versus the Book of Leviticus, and so that was just, I thought that was so fascinating because, whoa, my microphone just jumped out at me. You moved your bag. It's interesting. I always get the worst microphone stand, and Andy gets the better one.
It's been the same one since day one.
And so I don't know, man. I just don't know. This whole thing, you are so sketchy.
We just need contributions so we could step up.
Oh, really? That's where we're going with this?
Yeah.
Nice.
That was planned.
Yes, you need to clothe us because I'm tired of being in my boxer shorts. No, I just thought it was such an interesting. Why would you read the Bible any differently than Harry Potter, and why would you read the Harry Potter any differently than the Bible? I mean, if we can just determine what sacred texts are, then why not? Right? If it's sacred to us, it's sacred, correct? And so that could be fodder. I'm gonna listen to a couple episodes. One is white privilege. Betrayal, the midnight duel, promises, the potions master, vulnerability, the sorting hat. But evidently they're doing a great job because this thing is like just jumped. But I really thought, hey, that's a very interesting thing, and it throws into question because my 13-year-old son Nate. So Nate and I'll be doing whatever we're doing, and I'll be like, hey Nate, so what happens if you come across somebody who doesn't believe the Bible? What do you? And they say the Bible's made up. What do you say? And he says, I don't know. The Bible says it's the Word of God, so it's the Word of God. And I'm like, well, but there are lots of other things that say to be the Word of God too, right? So how do you know there's any difference between them? Or are they all not the Word of God, and they're just meaningful to the communities that receive them as such?
Right.
And Big Nate isn't really, he's not interested in that as much as he is, playing NBA 2K. But I'm trying. And so it could be an interesting podcast discussion about the sacred text. What does that mean? Why would the Bible ever be considered that? Because it kind of gets a little bit at some of the stuff Godless was raising.
Uh-huh.
What does it mean for something to be a sacred text? So anyway, I just thought I'd throw that out there.
I'm shocked no one's done this on Star Wars yet. I mean, for as long as it's been around.
I'm sure. I remember it happening with The Matrix. Now, I remember this was 1999, so it was like 50 years ago for the millennial crowd. There was a century called the 19s that existed. That many of us who hold power now.
Right. Isn't that when the Depression happened?
Yes.
Sometime in the 90s?
There were wars. Anyway, so the Matrix movie came out, and then there were all these books about the gospel in the Matrix, right? Totally. And finding Jesus in the Matrix, and all this just kind of weird stuff. Yeah. So this has a very long and rich history, but this isn't what I find interesting about this. It's not saying, hey, let's find stuff from other sacred texts in Harry Potter, which Christians have done that. Hey, here are Christians' allusions in Harry Potter. But this is, let's treat Harry Potter as if it were as sacred as the Bible, the Quran, the Torah, whatever. So interesting. Anyway, that has nothing to do with Godless Part 2. And we've not heard back from Godless. He's licking his wounds. He's repenting deeply in the wilderness of Ireland. He's come face to face with the airtight arguments that were presented in part one.
The patience of the Spirit has come upon him.
Yes.
He is restfully considering his reply.
Not so much. He's probably just probably got other stuff to do. But this is part two. And like we said, we want to respond to Godless. And because he asked some really great questions, and even the answers that we'll give will raise more questions, and you could do this forever. But like we said last time, there's something to be said for both sides being able to respectfully consider the possibility they're wrong, for both sides to engage each other thoughtfully, kindly, passionately. There's something to be said for. As the Bible exhorts believers to give an answer for the hope that you have, but to do so with gentleness and respect. And so this has been fun. It's been fun to go back and listen to that podcast where he was very gracious and very kind in sharing some of his story. And so anyway, this is part two. If you remember I actually went back and I typed out the things he said. And again, acknowledge that this isn't fair. He's not in the room. And he was speaking off the cuff. We're going back now and typing words he said up. And so he's at a complete disadvantage if you're going to look at it in debate terms, which is exactly what we don't want to do, which is why he's in the room. We're not interested in doing another debate. Those are very entertaining, but not profitable. Yeah. We are interested in just engaging in dialogue and conversation. So, and we do feel like it's worth having a point explored in all of its fullness rather than just sound bites kind of zipping back and forth. So Godless, so thank you for raising the questions that you raised, and here's some thoughts. You had said, and I thought, you told your story, and then I'm ripping these quotes kind of out of the context, but I hope I don't do them violence in the way that I use them. At one point you said there are claims in the Bible about something being a sin that I just don't believe to be a sin, and that's actually a pretty common critique. That there was a book written 10 years ago maybe, it was called "Searching for a Better God," and the argument of the book was that it wasn't any longer that people had intellectual objections to believing in God. It was they had moral objections to believing in God. That believing in God in the Christian sense actually made you a worse kind of person. So the argument was that people today, not generically of course, sit in judgment of God's behavior. And so that God engages in things that we would find offensive. So the genocide of the Old Testament, or the teachings about how to find out if your wife committed adultery or not by drinking this, and by putting to death this kid, or just all this crazy stuff. Or on the other side, that some of the moral teaching of the scriptures we find offensive. So it's not just God's teachings, but God's character that are called into judgment by something like that. So that's worth a very lengthy reply. And then you also said, and I thought this was the most interesting thing. You said, I think that Jesus failed at communicating what he communicated. If we're right, in the sense that if we take the New Testament kind of as sacred, then how in the world has it been so misunderstood, abused, whatever? Isn't it that on Jesus, isn't our confusion directly traced back to Jesus? And you say this, you said the Sermon on the Mount, so much of this I don't think is true. You shouldn't act this way in real life. And then you say, let's assume these are Jesus's words, and that's a big debate, in and of itself. Do you agree with all that is said there? Do you think what is said there is right? The Sermon on the Mount is not morally correct. And one of the examples you give is that when Jesus says, I'm here to fulfill the Old Testament, not to abolish it, this is the failure. If Jesus doesn't believe the Old Testament is true, then he never gives any indication or clarification of how we should understand it. And so the summary, here's how I hear his argument. Because our response, and we said this last podcast, our response is to anything in the Old Testament. Well, one of our responses, it's not the only, one of our responses is, well, listen, the pictures given of God in the Old Testament are by definition, according to the Bible itself, they're partial and they're incomplete. Jesus is the only full picture we get. In the book of Hebrews, Jesus is the exact representation, the hypostasis of God's character, meaning the very essence of what God is like. So the God revealed in Jesus is the God of the cross, the God that humbles himself, the God who serves and washes feet. I mean, that's the God that's revealed in Jesus. So the natural question is, well, okay, that seems a lot different than the vengeance and the wrath and the Old Testament of striking people down and here's a plague and da-da-da-da-da-da.
Heavy metal God.
The heavy metal God, exactly. So his point is, he would call, I think, into question my allegiance to Jesus if that Jesus does not correct the Old Testament, but instead says he's come to fulfill it. All right? So the idea is if Jesus validates the Old Testament, well then, and the Old Testament is immoral or amoral, then Jesus is amoral or immoral too. Make sense?
Yeah.
So that's I think that's kind of getting at the argument. And then he referenced Iron Chariot's wiki, which I read, which is a critique of the Sermon on the Mount in the King James. And so I think both in Godless's critique and in the Iron Chariot's wiki, there is a fundamental misunderstanding, and we made this point last time, of what it is for Jesus to be Jewish and to be teaching in a Jewish context. That I don't think it was a failure of communication. I think his contemporaries understood him completely and utterly in terms of what he was saying, and that's part of the reason why the religious leaders conspired against him. So part of the answer I want to give on this exact point is that Jesus actually does bring some clarification to the Old Testament. And he does this in interesting ways that I think sort of takes some of the sting out of Godless's accusation, and I think not totally, but for the most part, refute this Iron Chariot's wiki thing, if you go and you look at that. And so what I want to do is this one's pretty theological. Some of our podcasts are, I don't know, they're what are they? More topical.
They're general in the popular conversation.
Yes, general in the popular conversation. Others of them are theology, and so we've done some on this guy is called Suffering, and so those have been pretty theological. This one's going to be pretty theological too, because what I feel like I need to do is to say, this is what Jesus is doing in his Jewish context. And if we're going to be offended at him or sit in judgment of Jesus' teaching here, let's make sure we're hearing it correctly first. And Godless may hear what we're about to say and go, okay, well, that doesn't really change the fact that X, Y, and Z, the God of the Old Testament is still crazy and, blah, 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 blah. But I at least want to get the right Jesus understood in his Jewish context to be the one we're critiquing, and not necessarily the Christianized Greek versions of Jesus that are so common and presented today. Make sense?
Oh, yeah.
So the Sermon on the Mount is the name given to. Iron Chariot says it's this nonsense and mishmash of teaching in the book of Matthew. I think it is brilliant, and it is totally tied together. It's Matthew 5, 6, and 7. And it represents some of Jesus's most famous teaching and most profound teaching. And so to get into it, the relevant section is in Matthew 5, verse 17. Now, this is where it gets thick, but this is so important, Andy Bear. So Jesus says this, do not think that I've come to abolish the law or the prophets. I've not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. Now, this is Godless's, like, why didn't Jesus correct the Old Testament, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, he's saying he's come to fulfill it. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. All right. Now, how can you possibly misunderstand that? Isn't Jesus so clearly saying he's validating everything in the Old Testament?
Yeah.
And in one sense, that's exactly what he's saying. But notice the nuance. Hence the deep theology that begins now. The words abolish and fulfill, all right, were technical rabbinical terms. Jesus was a rabbi. Now, formal rabbis like reverends or rabbis today in synagogues, like undergoing a process of ordination, formal rabbis really weren't in play until the end of the first century. After the destruction of Jerusalem, about 20 years later, a group of very famous rabbis gathered together and began to sort out how Judaism would live and survive without Jerusalem and without its temple. That's when rabbi became a proper term. But prior to that, it was used in a term of respect, as you could also translate it master or sir, and it was used as a way to describe a respected teacher. Now, one of the ways respected teachers dialogued with each other, and Jesus, there were very clear in Jesus' day ways of interpreting the Old Testament text, dialoguing about the Old Testament text. And so one of the ways to talk about the text was in terms of abolishing it or fulfilling it. To fulfill the text meant to show its true intention. Okay? It's to show the heart of it. To interpret it rightly is what to fulfill meant. To abolish it meant to interpret it wrongly or to not obey it. Okay, so let me abolish was used in rabbinical discussions as a term for violating a commandment or misinterpreting a text. Fulfill means to preserve the text or sustain the text through proper interpretation. So what Jesus isn't doing is he's not coming and saying, hey, I've come to fulfill, in the sense that Godless is intimating, which is I'm validating everything that's happened and how it's currently being practiced. What he's doing instead is I've come to show you the true eternal nature of God's heart behind it. Okay? Here's the way it should look when it's worked out and taught. All right?
Okay.
Oh no, this is a big deal. So when you use abolish and fulfill together, so Jesus is saying that he is engaging in rabbinic debate against unnamed and unmentioned opponents. So he's having to defend himself and his interpretation because he was accused of undermining the law all over the place.
All over the place.
See, that's the thing that's so interesting, is that Jesus never got accused of doing what Godless says Jesus did. The failure of communication was against the religious leaders who were accusing Jesus of undermining the law and undermining their tradition. And so Jesus here has to say this at the very beginning of the Sermon on the Mount. This is Jesus saying, I'm not only aware of what's being said, but let me clarify. I've not come to abolish or to misinterpret the law or to break the commandments. I've actually come to show their true nature, to properly interpret them. So if a rabbi were misinterpreting the scripture, he would be told, you are abolishing or uprooting Torah. And if a rabbi were teaching scripture well, you would be told the rabbi was upholding or fulfilling Torah. Make sense? So what Jesus is doing isn't just providing a rubber stamp on everything that happened in the Old Testament. He's actually showing the true intent of what the law was intended to look like, properly done in Israel.
Right.
Oh my goodness, that's a whole different thing.
Yeah, because what you've talked about this, like ongoing through so many different things, the Pharisees were applying what was a belief, but the application of that belief was wrong. Because ultimately we're saying like that certain laws were true of what God said, but how they were carried out and how they were held became the compromising issue.
So Jesus, and he would do this with the church today, Jesus saw that the whole thing had been corrupted. Now there was a core, and he says that's the law itself. Now the law is the first 5 books of Torah. It's not the historical books. okay, where the genocide and those sorts of things. He says the law and the prophets. And then he says, he talks about the law, not the least stroke of the law will disappear. So he was.
Oh, that's really important.
It is important. Yeah. And so now there are responses to that, but let just that general sort of oversimplified point stand, just so I can keep going.
Mm-hmm.
So Jesus is saying the Torah, the law of God, will never cease to exist because the law is an expression of God's character. The law, according to New Testament teaching, was actually progressive for its time, and it was never meant to oppress. It was always to push forward culture. So culture, if culture was at place B, the laws that were given were at place C and place D. And the progressive nature of the Old Testament law is referenced all the time in the New Testament. Make sense?
Yeah. Is it a quick one-shot example, like of don't eat this because it was dangerous to humanity? I mean, is it that kind of stuff?
That's like mold, and the way communicable diseases were done, the way slaves were treated was revolutionary. The way women were treated. Now we read these, thousands of years removed from the culture and think they're barbaric,
right?
And they were.
Yeah.
And even in the New Testament, you have the objection, well, how come Paul didn't just try to outlaw slavery?
Yeah.
Well, what Paul was doing was he was doing two things. Number one, he was revolutionizing slavery by saying to masters and slaves, that relationship is not as important as being brothers and sisters now in Christ. Mm-hmm. So masters, treat your slaves in a revolutionary way. Slaves, respect your masters as you would Jesus. And he would encourage slaves to get their freedom, as he does with Onesimus and Philemon. Mm-hmm. But he was planting the seeds for the eventual overthrow of slavery altogether. Mm-hmm. So what God seems to do is God incarnates himself in culture, not just in Jesus, but the whole way through. So he will take culture where it is and invite it forward. He won't overturn it by force. He won't coerce it. He won't manipulate it, but he will always invite it forward. So you see that in Jesus, but you also see that in the 10 Commandments, and you see that in the 613 commandments of the Torah, the law. So what Jesus is saying, and this is how we can go back and see some of the Old Testament commandments and go, man, those things look so jacked up. Mm-hmm. Correct. They do to 21st century American Western Christians.
That's at like point Y now.
Right.
If that's at point B.
Correct. When you read historical accounts for how slaves were treated at the time, or how women were treated at the time, it seems like there's this inching forward, there's this cooperating with, there's this incarnating into culture in a way that plants the seeds for revolution, but also works within the existing structures as they are. Now you can say, well, that's just idiocy. I mean, God should have
just wiped the whole thing out.
Whole thing out and started over, right. Which is what he did with the flood, excuse me, and then we complain about that. So, whatever. So
he tried that.
So all that is to say, so Jesus starts by saying, I've come to reveal the true heart of the law. Not all of the way it's been misapplied, not all of the way it's been misinterpreted. He's not validating any of that. What he's saying is, I've come to reveal its true nature. Now, he's going to go after the most religious, the most righteous, the most authoritative teachers of his day, called the Pharisees. And the Pharisees, so the way that evangelicals think of Billy Graham and Mother Teresa and, our kind of like saints, was the way that many Jews of the day thought of Pharisees. The Pharisees were the religious ninjas. They were the most zealous for the law. They took the 613 commandments of the Old Testament, and they added hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of commandments called fences around those 613 commandments. So if the commandment was, and we've talked about this before, if the commandment was, don't touch the desk, they would add a fence that said, don't even enter the room where the desk is.
Yeah.
Right? Or don't even enter the house where the desk is.
Yeah.
So those were fences. The Pharisees thought that those fences held the same authority as the law of Moses did, and Jesus is going to really go after them and say, no, it doesn't. The other thing that the Pharisees did is that the Pharisees spent a lot of time debating between how you arbitrate contradictions between the laws. So, but if you have 613 laws, and then you add hundreds and if not thousands of rules to them, you're going to have contradictions. So, if the rule is, man, save life wherever possible, and the rule is don't do any work on the Sabbath, you then had to figure out, okay, so if someone's life is in jeopardy on the Sabbath, which is the more important law? So the words they would use are light and heavy, okay? So which was the weightier law and which was the lighter law? Make sense?
Okay.
So the lighter law was the law that could be broken in order to keep the heavy one. Go ahead.
I was saying, it's almost like, is that where we get that interesting picture of justice being on a scale? And like how you could remove something and it would still wouldn't maybe change?
I don't know that.
Huh. That's interesting.
Maybe Harry Potter will tell us.
Yeah.
Now, Jesus is saying, listen, the law is eternal because it's a reflection of God's character, and that he has come to be its absolute determinative arbiter and revealer. Okay? Massively important. Then he says, therefore, anyone who sets aside one of the least of these commands, one of the lightest of these commands, and teaches others accordingly will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. If you set aside the least commands, you're going to be least in my movement, is the idea. But whoever practices and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. Now, here is this is the part that nobody respects in the Sermon on the Mount. This is the verse that tells you exactly what Jesus is doing for the next 2.5 chapters. All right? For I tell you that unless your rightness before God surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, none of you will see this. Excuse me, let me say that again. For unless your rightness before God surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. Okay? Now listen. That's like me saying, you've got to be a better person than Billy Graham. You've got to be a better person than Mother Teresa. If you're not a better person than Billy Graham, you will never enter into my kingdom, right? I mean, the Pharisees were these were like the elites religiously. And so notice what Jesus is doing. First, he says, I've come to reveal the true heart of the law. But against who and against what? Well, those who teach that you can break the least of the commands. So your rightness must surpass that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, or you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. I mean, oh my Lord, this is ridiculous. This is turning it's turning the predominant expression of zealous Judaism up on its head. It's flipping it upside down. It's just absolutely crazy. So what does Jesus mean when he says this? Now, this is where I don't think Godless and the Iron Chariots Wiki appreciate what Jesus is doing now. Now Jesus is going to give 6 antitheses, okay, using the following form. You have heard it said, but I tell you. Okay, so notice, let me pick one here. Murder. You have heard it said to the people long ago, you shall not murder. Okay? That's obviously a heavy commandment.
Right.
But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. And anyone who says to a brother or sister, you fool, which is what rakah means, is answerable to the court. Or you idiot, expressing contempt. Now, Iron Chariots Wiki will say, really, you've just equated anger and contempt with murder, right? Really? I mean, come on. How immoral is that? I mean, that's literally one of the arguments on the Iron Chariots Wiki.
Yeah.
No. That's not what Jesus is doing. Jesus is critiquing the Pharisees, who were considered the most righteous in Israel. And he's saying, nope, the Pharisees have missed it in the following respect. They teach you that you can break the least of the commandments as long as you keep the heavy ones. And usually what the Pharisees do is they delineate that the least of the commandments are the inward ones, and the heaviest commandments are the outward ones.
Yeah, right.
And Jesus is going to flip that. And other rabbis do this. Like one rabbi commenting on Leviticus said this, all right? That light sins, light commands, if you fail to keep light commands, you will end up breaking heavy commands. That's what Jesus is saying. So here's a parallel. Another rabbi talking about Leviticus. He who violates the command, love your neighbor as yourself, will ultimately violate the command, you shall not hate your brother in your heart. Okay? So the first one, love your neighbor as yourself. Well, that seems pretty light. But if you don't honor that, then pretty soon you'll actually hate your brother in your heart. And you will then break the command, you shall not take vengeance or bear any grudge against your brother or neighbor until in the end you will come to the shedding of blood. Okay, so it's like this descent. If you don't honor the command to love your brother or love your neighbor, then you will not honor the command that prohibits hating your neighbor. Then you will not honor the command that prohibits revenge. And ultimately, that will lead you to not honor the command to murder. All right? Or to not murder, excuse me. So it's this really interesting thing that other rabbis were doing. So what Jesus is doing is he's looking at the Pharisaic abuse and the way the Pharisees had actually lightened the demands of the law by making it purely external. As if walking around not murdering summarized God's full heart for human beings. Yeah. Right? So it's as if, I didn't murder anybody today. Well, to Jesus, that's irrelevant next to what God's heart is for humanity, which is what? To love your neighbor as yourself. To not murder is a much lower requirement, a much lower bar. Does that make sense? Yeah. And so what Jesus is doing is he's showing the true heart of the law by exposing the way the Pharisees had practiced a false form of rightness before God that he says, actually, you have to jettison altogether. Your rightness to his disciples, it must surpass their rightness. Well, it's going to. Why? Because the rightness of Jesus is internal rightness that works itself out externally. So another example. You've heard it said, you shall not commit adultery. That's a heavy commandment. But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Yeah. Now, again, Iron Chariot has a field day with this. Really? Really? So you're telling me I might as well just go ahead and commit adultery then if I've lusted after a woman in my heart? What? That's not what Jesus is doing. Jesus is engaging in the exposing of the Pharisees' false view of righteousness by giving examples of the way they've lightened the law by teaching people that the least commands didn't have to be honored. Right. All right? Because
you have to imagine the Pharisees are walking around with all their Pharisee buddies, checking out girls, gossiping, talking terribly of other people.
But here's the thing. Here's the thing. The Pharisees, that's not true. The Pharisees made a very public show of never looking at a woman. In fact, we have records in later rabbinic writings of Pharisees who would walk into walls. So they called them bleeding Pharisees because they would trip over things. They would run into walls because they would so avoid looking at a woman lustfully. All right? And guess what guess what Jesus's point is? Whether or not you look at a woman is irrelevant to whether or not lust is in your heart.
Okay, all right. So that,
because then he says
they were trying so hard to not do that.
Yeah, the external part.
Right. Yeah.
So then Jesus says, if your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out, throw it away. It's better for you to lose one part of your body than your whole body be thrown in hell. No, Jesus, this is rabbinic hyperbole right here. This is so common. We take this as law. Jesus is not giving law here. Jesus is showing what the true heart of God behind the law is. These are examples of the kind of rightness that far surpasses the Pharisee. To the Pharisee says, I've not committed adultery. To the disciple of Jesus talks about, I've not lusted. because where does lust lead? Adultery never happens in a vacuum. It always starts. Murder never happens in a vacuum. It starts with anger. Where does adultery start? It starts with lust. So Jesus is actually exposing how the Pharisees have cheapened the law, right? Yeah. So when Godless says, why didn't Jesus correct? Well, he is correcting.
Right. This is it.
He shuts down the temple. He declares all food clean. He reinterprets the law through himself. After his resurrection, he says, the law and the prophets, they all testify to me. Jesus places himself squarely in the middle of the entire Old Testament conversation. So do I think that Jesus stood in judgment over the Old Testament? Yes and no. No, in the sense that he affirms that God's law as a reflection of his character is good. Yes, he stands in judgment over the way that it had been misinterpreted and misapplied. And so what Jesus is doing, and he would do this today with Christianity. I mean, if he shows up today, he'd do the exact same thing with the people claiming to be his, right?
Right.
So you have this about divorce. You have this about oaths. Let your yes be yes and your no be no. Don't make oaths, right? Because there was this huge, complicated formulas about making an oath and not using the name of God in order to honor the third commandment. The third commandment was don't attach the name of God to anything empty, like a promise or a person. And so they would use, instead of God's name, they would say by Jerusalem or by the temple. And those were just locutions that were a roundabout way of referring to God. And Jesus said, just dispense with that, man. Let your yes be yes and your no be no. So what Jesus is doing, these aren't random teachings. He's giving 6 examples of how Jesus is showing the true heart behind the law. And the true heart of the law was that love God and love neighbor is the point.
Right.
And the 613 commandments are just expressions of love God and love neighbor. In fact, the 10 commandments are just expressions. The first 4 are love God. The last 6, I think, are love neighbor. And so what Jesus is doing here is he's radically altering the trajectory of the Judaism of his day. Remember, he comes first to the Jews.
Right.
And he's not coming to replace Israel. He's coming to renew Israel from the inside. So he comes as a Jew to the Jews,
right.
And he collects other Jews to form a new nucleus of Israel. So he has 12 apostles. That's the highly symbolic number, of course. So Jesus is a renewal project. And so the first part of the Sermon on the Mount, like you've heard it said, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Well, that was a command in the Old Testament, for crying out loud. 2 or 3 places. Now, for the time, it limited revenge. So it was actually revolutionary for its time. And we find that in other codes of ancient Near Eastern cultures. We find it in other moral codes, because revenge could just go for generations. You kill my daughter, I kill your family. Then you kill my clan, and I go after your tribe. Yeah. I mean, it would just increase. But notice he says, but I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek. If anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, give them your coat as well. Now these, and again, and Godless, if you listen to this, you got to understand what Jesus is doing here is he's teaching active, nonviolent resistance. Jesus is actually instructing people how to shame the Romans who would do these precise things. And again, he's not shaming them for the sake of punishing them or getting revenge. But what he's doing is, listen, when you are slapped on one side of your face, right? The way, and we've talked about this briefly, right? The way a superior would slap an inferior is with the back of his hand. The offering, you would only slap an equal. Now, and again, this doesn't make sense to us because we're not honor, shame, status people. But in the ancient Near East, if you were a superior and you slapped an inferior, you'd use the back of your hand. You use the open palm to slap an equal. So by turning the other cheek, you were saying that if you're going to hit me again, it has to be as an equal. Or if a Roman soldier, and under Roman law, Roman soldiers could do this. They could conscript you to carry their armor, their kit, for a mile. So Jesus says, well, offer to carry it too. because the heart of God is over and above the minimum requirements. But secondly, you will actually, and this is a proverb, you'll actually be pouring hot coals over their head. Or someone sues you, and they're suing you for your outer garment. Give them, your inner garment. Give them your outer garment too. And that actually will shame them, because under the law, you were not allowed to sue for both garments. You could only sue for one. So, I mean, Jesus is doing genius stuff here, but it's all culturally conditioned against the project of the Pharisees. Now, I'm oversimplifying this, Andy. There are 1,000 things that I'm going to remember to say, because the Pharisees weren't the bad guys. That's the point. They were the good guys, and that's why this was so shocking. Mm-hmm. Now, then Jesus does this. He says, be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of others to be seen by them. If you do, you'll have your reward from your Father in heaven. You'll have your reward from the Father in heaven will just be the fact that you were noticed. All right, so he's shifted to another big critique of the Pharisees. Because the Pharisees, and he critiques them in Matthew, I think it's 23 or 24, and we did this with spiritual abuse in Luke. Remember when Jesus critiques how they would pray in the marketplaces? They'd have phylacteries that were really long, or tassels that were really long. They loved the choice seats in the synagogue. I mean, so what Jesus is going to do is he's saying, listen, you have to put on display a rightness before God that surpasses the scribes and the Pharisees, but don't practice it like they do to gain the approval of others. Do it in secret, and your Father who sees it in secret. Again, it's a heart thing. It's not an outward thing. Make sense?
Yeah.
So this whole thing goes together. At Iron Chariot's wiki, they're like, oh, well, notice here, this part contradicts an earlier part. No, it doesn't. Jesus is leveling massive critiques against the practices of the Pharisees. And unless you're aware of the practices of the Pharisees, you're not going to be aware of what he's saying. And so then Jesus talks about prayer and fasting, and then he talks about money. He spends a whole section, because almsgiving was huge, prayer was huge, public prayer was huge, almsgiving was huge, fasting was huge. And so he talks about these three big pieces of Jewish piety, and he provides the counter to what the Pharisees were doing. Now, we can keep going, but I think the general point is simply this. The Pharisees were, Jesus was most like them in terms of his theology. The Pharisees believed in resurrection. Jesus believed in resurrection. The Pharisees believed in the miraculous. Jesus believed, obviously, in the miraculous. The Pharisees were master students of the text. Jesus was a master student of the text. So part of the reason why they bump into each other so much is because they're a lot alike. And the Pharisees, in their zeal to keep Israel pure, would have seen Jesus in a bunch of ways, but in a couple specifically. Number one, in his disregarding of their fences. So he gets into trouble all the time for touching lepers, being touched by sinners, healing on the Sabbath. I mean,
being close to women.
He's running afoul of their fences all the time. But he's also at the same time critiquing them in very deep and significant ways and presenting an alternative vision of what it meant to be the people of God. Which is what? Love of God, love of neighbor. It wasn't burdened down by thousands of commandments. It wasn't the corrupt the corrupt elite of the temple complex fleecing the poor of Israel. It wasn't the boasting that, well, I haven't murdered today, so I fulfilled the commandments of God. I mean, no, it was an entirely different vision. And the vision was based on the revelation that Jesus himself says, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. It wasn't just that Jesus came to reveal the heart of God for the law. He came to reveal God, God who gave the law.
Yeah.
So Jesus is what it looks like when God's will is done on earth. That's why I have no problem saying there are bits and pieces of the Old Testament that I'm absolutely uncomfortable with, that I don't understand. I don't get how they fit. I don't think they show off the beautiful God that's revealed in Jesus. I don't understand them. So there are options with what do you do? And this is worthy of another podcast at some point. What do you do with the ugly pieces of the Old Testament? Some people ignore them, Other people say that they are the record of Israel's interpretation of God, not of God himself. So that's an interesting nuance.
That's an interesting twist on it.
Yeah. It leads to some pretty sketchy places though, because then and what other firm foundation can you say that the whole thing isn't just the interpretation of it? And maybe you do, or you could say, listen, and there are lots of books written this way. The God of the Old Testament isn't barbaric as we thought. Like Paul Copan, 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 wrote a book called "Is God a Moral Monster?" in response to the atheists that Godless mentioned. And there in that book, he softens some of what we find so offensive. In some of the implications or some of the practices or the teachings of the Old Testament. And so there's some good stuff there. For me, the better idea is that God always incarnates himself in culture and he moves it along slowly. And because that just seems to be what's happened, right? So Jesus, for instance, and this will end here. Jesus is asked about divorce for any and every reason. And this was a very technical rabbinical discussion. There were two primary rabbinical schools of thought. There was a command in Deuteronomy that said, as long as you write a certificate of divorce, a man can divorce his wife. And attached to that divorce was a stipulation that said a man can divorce his wife if he finds something indecent in her. And the big debate in Jesus's day was, what counts as indecent, right? Now, when that law was given, it was revolutionary. Why? Because a woman now had legal reason for being alone, not moral reason. In other words, a divorced woman was typically thought to be sinful, trash, property, just open to abuse. To give a woman a certificate of divorce was a legal document explaining her status now, not as someone who was immoral, but a status now in the community as somebody who'd been put away by a husband. But that actually gave her some protection that she wouldn't have had otherwise. All right, we can get more into that someday if we'd like. The big point, though, is Jesus gets brought into the first century discussion, which is, hey, something indecent. One group of rabbis taught that something indecent could include a burnt meal. Another school of thought said, no, it has to be something immoral. So Jesus jumps into this, and he says, and it's this beautiful, beautiful, beautiful picture later in the book of Matthew. He's asked about it in Matthew 19. Let me flip there so I get it right. Jesus is brought into this, and he says, haven't you read? So some Pharisees, so it's the Pharisees, all right, come to test Jesus. Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason? So which school of thought, Jesus, do you belong to? The one that says any and every reason is really any and every reason, or do you take the more conservative view? Haven't you read, Jesus replies, that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female and said, for this reason a man will leave his father and mother, be united to his wife, the two will become one flesh. So they're no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. So Jesus just quotes Genesis. And he says it, haven't you read? It's just absolutely genius. Why then, the Pharisee said, did Moses command that a man give his wife a certificate of divorce and send her away? If God's intent was that they would be together for a lifetime, then why did Moses command that we give her a certificate when we send her away? Oh, and then this is so big. Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard. But it was not this way from the beginning. I tell you, now, do you see what Jesus is doing? He's setting himself in the place of Moses.
In the beginning. Yeah.
I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another woman commits adultery. This was so scandalous, the disciples said, if this is the situation between a husband and wife, it's better not to marry at all. That's how common divorce was, right? So do you see what Jesus has done? What Jesus has done is said, listen, God's heart was revealed at the very beginning. But because the hearts of people were hard, God permitted divorce so that women would be protected. But I tell you, now is the definitive revealer of God's heart regarding the law. That was never his intention. Now, oh my goodness. Now, do you see what Jesus has just opened up? Jesus has just opened up the possibility that God is moving incrementally. He's moving humanity incrementally along. And he's ahead of them by just a couple of steps. Now, we know he's ahead of them by way more than that, right? He's ahead of us far beyond what he's more beautiful, more holy. He's good, blah, 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 blah. But the way he's engaging in culture is very incarnational. He's taking on the flesh and blood of the world that his people find themselves in, and he's moving them along. And so So I see some of the bits and pieces of Old Testament teaching that I'm super uncomfortable with. My responses are along the lines of if they contradict the picture of that is given to us in Jesus, then I view those pictures as partial and incomplete. They're only revealing one part of God's character, not the full part. Secondly, I think it is possible that Israel, as it edited the Old Testament, made itself look better than what it was originally. And you can see this when you compare 1st and 2nd Samuel with 1st and 2nd Chronicles. So 1st and 2nd Samuel we think was written before the exile. 1st and 2nd Chronicles was written after the exile. And when you compare pieces of the life of David, David gets cleaned up in Chronicles. And so it could be, for instance, one of the things that the people of Israel say is that they've totally destroyed every Canaanite in the land. And yet you read a couple chapters later that there's still Canaanites in the land.
Yeah.
And so, how much of that is just the boasting of, I don't know.
Of humans versus...
Yeah,
right,
but my point is, if it's possible to misunderstand Jesus after 2,000 years of being away from culture, well, how much more 3,000 or 3,500 years for some of the Old Testament stuff? So I'm not prepared to condemn it on the basis of a 21st century understanding of morality. What I'm interested in is what was common in the day, what was revolutionary for the time, how was it? So, like, for instance, when Paul says, wives submit to your husbands, well, no duh, that was what they were there for. The revolutionary part was husbands love your wives. In Roman culture, because he's writing to Ephesus, in Roman culture, husbands owed nothing to their wives except food, shelter, and the opportunity to bear biological children. That was it. They had courtesans, they had prostitutes. I mean, man, the last thing they owed was love. And so when Paul writes more verses to husbands about loving your wife as you love yourself, that's what was revolutionary. Submit to your wife. I mean, wife submit to your husband. Well, that's what they did. So in every instance I've come across, there was a stepping forward, a calling forward of human beings into what God's original heart was for them. All right? Now that raises a zillion other questions. So what about homosexuality? What about slavery? What about, I mean, we could spend a field day. Like, the Bible doesn't seem ahead of culture on homosexuality. It seems behind culture on homosexuality. It didn't seem ahead of culture in slavery, because look at all of the Christians that use the Bible to justify slavery.
Yeah.
So again, this is not in any way, shape, or form a definitive word. This is, if Godless and I were sitting in a bar and he let me talk for 45 minutes, which I don't think would ever happen, nor I him.
This is what you would say if that opportunity actually presented itself.
Yes, this isn't. This isn't a scholarly presentation. This isn't an academic critique. This is, I think some of what Godless was saying and some of what this Iron Chariots thing, I think they were based on misunderstanding fundamentally what Jesus was doing in his Jewish context. All right.
I think that, and just as a fair response to that, with a lot of messages and other sermons I've heard in the same thing, seem also grossly misinterpreted alongside that too, and it's Christians saying it.
Well, sure.
So it's
well,
just,
sure. I mean, and yes, and we do that all the time.
Yeah.
I mean, there's so many examples.
So many.
But we're not saying please don't hear, because the very easy thing is, hey, we've got the right interpretation and all other interpretations are wrong. No. We're just saying learning the culture and respecting Jesus's Jewishness is absolutely fundamental to understanding Jesus. Mm-hmm. And if you're going to critique Jesus, then we've got to put him back in his Jewish context. Don't critique the Christian version of Jesus or the church version of Jesus. Critique the Jewish version of Jesus, because that's how he came. Now, an objection could be made, well, we can't, because the church got a hold of him and Christianized him. So Godless could say, hey, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John don't even give us the Jewish Jesus. And that would be, but that's a different objection to the one initially we were talking about, right?
Sure.
So again, this can go back and forth for years. This can go back and forth for decades. That's why there is no definitive last word, other than for those of us who are disciples and followers of this Jesus, there is a sense that the Bible is clear in some of its big points, but is really open to misunderstanding if it's not read in its proper context. Mm-hmm. And for those of you considering the Bible or object to the Bible or whatever, man, if I ripped it out of its context, I'd object to it too. Because you can make the thing say anything you want. I mean, you can make it contradict itself. You can make it do whatever. Mm-hmm. And so anyway, again, I don't live or die by whether or not the Bible's infallible. We had a whole podcast on that. I prefer to call it inspired. But that then just raises the question, well, is Harry Potter inspired too? So a couple of thoughts as we go. First of all, we have two podcasts. One is this one, and then another one is called the Vox Community Podcast. And that one is found at voxoc.com or on iTunes if you type in Vox Community. And that's our little church. We have this, we're trying to form a community around all the things we talk about in the podcast. And we've got a couple hundred people who are joining us for the adventure, and it's really fun because some of these folks are Jesus followers and some of them are not, and some of them are really in process and have been hurt, and some of them it's absolutely fascinating. We're learning so much. But if you want to record a little bit of something that's a little more like teachy about Jesus, I mean, that's where you could go. Mm-hmm. The other thing is we're so grateful for anything you do on iTunes. For us. Many of you have liked the podcast. You've rated it. Many of you have left comments. We read all of those. We're so very grateful for them. We really do. And we are very grateful for them. And the reason is it just gets us noticed by iTunes. And as you know, the goal for us is world domination. So we can't take over the world unless we've taken over iTunes. That's the first
right.
piece.
And now we're chasing the Harry Potter one.
Now we're chasing Harry Potter. So I'm gonna go buy a Harlequin romance. Do they even make those anymore? Like a romance novel, one of these sappy like romance novels.
I wouldn't be surprised if there's a comeback now with like Stranger Things on Netflix with like.
What is Stranger Things? What is that?
Yeah, it's an incredible like homage to like 80s horror suspense films, and it's a new series, and it's like. And it's like kids, like in the exploration of this thing that's happening, and I think you would love it.
So it's a recent. Yeah,
it's
series?
a new film made by new directors, and they shoot it like the same way Super 8 was made a few years ago.
Yes,
it's basically an homage in a TV series.
Ooh, good use of homage.
Yeah,
twice.
to do that.
Yes, yes. Thank you.
Now you know. Now the world knows.
But I want to just find like. No, we're still talking. Thanks, Mama. Yeah. No, we're still talking. We're still recording. Yep. Thank you.
So it wouldn't be a real
without a Justy interruption. You haven't called in forever. That's okay. We love you. Did you say come upstairs? Because I'm gonna. and make out? Is that what you just said to me?
No.
Did you say come upstairs? Did you say
Earmuffs.
Hannah B? All right. So what were we talking about before we're so rudely?
I was talking about Stranger Things.
Oh, yes. And we'd gotten on the Stranger Things because
of the Harry Potter world domination.
Okay, so yeah. I want to get like an old romance novel.
Yeah.
And let's read it as sacred text.
Okay.
And let's just see what happens.
Okay.
Or sacred sext. Oh. All right. Well.
Oh.
Yeah. That's all I got. How long are we?
Hey, we're at 1 hour and 5 minutes.
Oh my goodness, dude. Dang it. Every time I think this will be a short one.
No, see, it's every time we talk about Jesus.
Yeah. So anything you want to add to this whole thing?
I like this stuff.
Now, hey, do you want to let people know you've been nominated for?
No, because it's done by now. By the time this
okay.
comes out, it's done.
Okay.
It doesn't matter.
All right. Andy was nominated to be a year-long recipient of what coffee?
Bear Coast Coffee.
Bear Coast Coffee. And if you don't know where Bear Coast is, there's North Coast and South Coast and East Coast and West Coast, and then there's Bear Coast.
That's right.
And so Andy put out, he was nominated on social media, and then so we're going to do a podcast on why I cannot in good conscience vote for Andy, and it's a lot of the same reasons I can't vote for Trump. So we'll do that one next.
Okay, good. Which will just be a pro-Hillary podcast.
Of course, because if you're not for Trump, you're against Hillary.
You're clearly for Hillary.
Yes, clearly, and you want our country to be destroyed. All right, let's close up shop here, Andy. An hour. All right, Godless, we're done. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Host a pint in our honor, some Irish pub. While we drink Bear Coast coffee in the hopes of getting a year-long supply. All right. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord shine his face upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord lift up his countenance to you, and may he give you peace today and tomorrow and the next day after that. So we love you. We're grateful for you. Thanks for tuning in.
Thanks for listening to Vox, the Mike Erre podcast. Be sure to like Mike on Facebook at facebook.com/official Mike Erre. Follow Mike on Twitter and Periscope at Mike Erre for live interaction and ongoing Q&A. Don't forget to visit subversivekingdom.com for further engagement and information about Mike.